During World War II, the German military had over 1.5 million non-ethnic Germans serving within its ranks. One of the most fascinating groups were the former Soviet soldiers and civilians who volunteered to serve Adolf Hitler, as they viewed Stalin as the greater of two perceived evils. Many of these Russians, Georgians, and Ukrainians served in many different capacities, from ground soldiers in the Army and Waffen-SS to flying as pilots in the Russian Army of Liberation Air Force. What was the Russian Army of Liberation, also known as ROA? What motivated these former Soviet subjects to fight for the Germans? How were they perceived by Hitler and the upper leadership? What started the active recruitment of these Eastern Europeans, and who was their leader? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. The creation of the Eastern Legions was the collective concept of several officers. One was Rudolf Christoph Baron von Gersdorff. In World War II, he was an Army Group Center intelligence staff officer. It was Gersdorff who discovered the first of the many mass graves from the Katyn massacre in April 1943, which contained the remains of over 4,000 of the 22,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia shot by the NKVD in 1940. Another was Abwehr Intelligence Chief Major General Reinhard Gehlen, whom Hitler and his generals relied upon for detailed information on Soviet capabilities and personalities. Gehlen had an idea in 1941 to convert and recruit Eastern Europeans, most Russians and Ukrainians who were captured and recruited from the many Soviet prisoners of war, into a special legion made up of various units. Yet another proponent of this concept was World War I veteran Helmuth von Panwitz, who had been commissioned as a lieutenant at age 16 and awarded the Iron Cross Second and First Class for bravery in World War I. He was Gehlen's first choice in the recruiting effort, as Panwitz already had good contacts with the anti-communist Cossack leadership in the Don River Basin, and he had accepted some of these men who came over and asked to fight against Stalin. The greatest opportunity for this plan to see daylight came when Soviet Lieutenant General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov was captured. The Germans knew who he was, and his fame among the Soviets was believed to be an asset. Vlasov was asked about the prospect, and he was able to gain the support of Hitler's Foreign Affairs Chief, Alfred Rosenberg, who then had a meeting with Gehlen, Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler, and SS Major General Karl Wolff. Vlasov was of great interest to Gehlen, as he knew his record. In 1938, Vlasov was sent to China to serve as a military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. When the war began in 1939, Vlasov was recalled back to Moscow. In October 1939, Vlasov was given command of the 99th Rifle Division, and he was rapidly promoted to lieutenant general and defended the city of Kiev against the Germans in 1941 while commanding the 37th Army. When the German army attacked Moscow, Vlasov's 20th Army was sent north, and they executed a counterattack and retook the Moscow towns that had been captured by the Germans, earning Georgy Zhukov's admiration and the Order of the Red Banner. The defense of Moscow became his biggest claim to fame up till that time, and many newspapers and publications called him one of the defenders of Moscow. In January 1942, he was sent to relieve Leningrad, but his Second Shock Army had no support despite his repeated requests. His position became untenable by March 1942, and in order to save his army and his own staff from encirclement and starvation, he asked for permission to retreat until reinforced for a counterattack. Stalin initially refused, and Vlasov's men fought without resupply or reinforcements. By April, they were out of ammunition and starving. They were still holding on in June 1942 when Stalin sent an airplane to rescue Vlasov. By that time, Vlasov had already turned against Stalin. Stalin ordered that every man would fight to the last bullet and essentially told them to die with honor. Vlasov basically said, "To hell with that." Vlasov would not abandon his men, and he would not let them die. He had too many wounded and sick men, so he surrendered shortly thereafter. Knowing Vlasov's hatred of Stalin, Galen saw the military value of possibly having millions of disaffected Soviets fighting with Germany against the USSR. Propaganda Minister Dr. Joseph Goebbels also saw value in these soldiers as a valuable propaganda tool, hopefully increasing defections and demoralizing the enemy. The concept was drafted to create a special unit. These volunteers were called Heavies, from the German word Hilfswilligen, or help volunteers, and most were consigned to non-combat roles at first. But that would change. By the end of the war, around 1 million former Soviets would have served in various capacities, with 300,000 operating in combat units in total. This number includes combat replacements over time due to casualties. The Russian Army of Liberation, or ROA, was mostly former Soviet prisoners of war, but also included white Russian émigrés, some of whom were veterans of the anti-communist White Army from the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1923. These were men who knew well that returning to the Soviet Union was a death sentence. Stalin had issued his orders that, quote, "There was no such thing as a Soviet prisoner of war, only traitors and collaborators," end quote. In October 1942, the Germans established a Cossack district in the Kuban and were able to recruit Cossacks from these areas and use them against the Red Army. Of interest was the fact that most soldiers of the Don and Kuban Cossack units had never accepted being citizens of the Soviet Union. The majority of the older Cossacks, especially their leadership, were still royalists and were purged by the communists for their resistance. Due to the successful propaganda campaign, 2 ace pilots of the Soviet Air Force, Semyon Trofimовich Byechkov and Brunislav Romanovich Antilevsky, defected and became part of the ROA Air Force, which was commanded by Major General Maltsev, Viktor Ivanovich. They often flew missions with such luminary units as the Luftwaffe's JG. On 14 November 1944, it was officially renamed the Armed Forces of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia. On 28 January 1945, it was officially declared that the Russian divisions were no longer part of the German army, but would directly be under the command of the KONR. With the transfer of the Volunteer Cossack Stamm Regiment No. 5 from the Freiwilligen, or the Volunteer Stamm Division, on the same day the takeover of the Cossack units by the Waffen-SS was complete. Panvitz then created and commanded the original Cossack Cavalry Brigade, which he had formed on 21 April 1943 from Don Basin Cossacks who hated the communists. The unit specialized in anti-partisan operations in Ukraine and Belarus, and was deployed to Yugoslavia to fight Tito's partisans, supporting the 13th Waffen-SS Division Handschar, made up of Bosnian Muslims, and the 7th Waffen-SS Mountain Division Prince Eugen. During their operations in Serbia and Croatia, the Cossack regiments, under Panvitz's command, committed a number of atrocities against civilians who had been supporting Joseph Broz Tito, the communist leader in Yugoslavia. Their crimes included rapes and executions. When Panvitz learned of these atrocities, he issued an order dated 20 October 1943, stating that anyone who conducted themselves in this manner would be executed. He demanded iron-hard discipline. On 26 August 1944, SS Reichsfuhrer Himmler met with Major General von Panvitz and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Hans-Joachim von Schultz. Himmler informed them that their Cossacks were now under the command of the SS, and that the unit was now designated the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps. Panvitz at first refused to enter the SS, telling Himmler, quote, "I have been in the army since I was 15. To leave it now would seem to me like desertion," end quote. Himmler then offered to place all Cossacks under von Panvitz's command, and he accepted. Also in November 1944, the 1st Cossack Division was taken over by the Waffen-SS directly. Himmler then consolidated other Cossack combat units from the army and the Ordnungspolizei, or Order Police, to form a 2nd Cossack Cavalry Division. Both divisions were placed under the command of the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps on 1 February 1945 under Panvitz's command. By his own request, von Panwitz was discharged from the army on 10 February 1945 and entered the Waffen-SS the next day with a promotion and a rank of SS Lieutenant General. After Russian General Stipin's death in Zagreb, the independent state of Croatia, on 30 April 1945, Russian Colonel Anatoly Rogozin took over and led his troops farther north to surrender to the British in southern Austria. Unlike most other Russian formations that fought for Nazi Germany, Rogozin and his men, who were not formally treated as Soviet citizens, were exempt from the forced repatriation to the Soviet Union, and they were eventually set free and allowed to resettle in the West. By this stage in the war, Himmler and Hitler were very wary and tired of the former Soviet soldiers and decided to be rid of them. Vlasov found out, and when his men were in Prague, they ended up fighting the SS in support of the Czech resistance, mainly the partisans from Moravia and Bohemia. The men of Roa knew that Lieutenant General George S. Patton was on the way, so that motivated them to fight the Germans. However, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered Patton to not enter Prague. It was a local matter. Vlasov realized that he would not have American assistance, and after liberating Prague, he ordered his men to head west. Despite receiving word that the war was over on 8 May 1945, the Cossack units also continued fighting on their way to the west and to the British zone. On 10 May 1945, Panwitz surrendered to the British, while the last division elements reached the British zone on 13 May 1945. Although the division had fought westwards to surrender to the Western Allies, the British later surrendered all Cossack units to the Red Army. This was in line with the agreement made at Yalta, where Stalin demanded any former Soviet prisoners be handed over, in exchange for ensuring any Western airmen or soldiers would also be repatriated from the Soviet Union. American units, such as the 44th Infantry Division, had thousands of Cossacks, and most of these were also handed over. However, some officers, feeling sympathy for these men, allowed them to slip away and not be repatriated. After being handed over, several thousand Cossacks were killed in a mass execution near Linz, Austria, while the commanding officers, including von Panwitz and others, were taken to Moscow. After a standard Soviet-style kangaroo court, Panwitz was executed in Moscow on 16 January 1947, having been convicted by a military tribunal of war crimes in the Soviet Union, as were nearly all of his Cossacks. Andrei Vlasov was himself executed earlier on 1 August 1946. So ended the great Russian Army of Liberation. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.